Ungers, Afterall, Fragments of a Project for Gibellina, edited by Elena Catalano, Alessandro Iannello, Tommaso Mola Meregalli, and Costanza Zeni, published by Viaindustriae. After Rangers, by Winston Hampel. Among the wealth of material stored in the Ungers archive in Cologne, there is remarkably little relating to the project in Gibellina Nuova. Given the limited scope, one is compelled to look very closely at the documents that are kept in the archive. These are mainly divided into two folders, one containing the project's presentation and drawings, the other administrative documents and letters. One can read through the intricacies of the typed as well as handwritten back and forth regarding technicalities of site visits, organization and payment, just as well as through the paragraphs of contracts and regulations. But one document stands out, not least because it is one of the earliest in the folder. A simple leaflet, though printed in striking red ink, announcing a conference held in September 1981 entitled L'Intervento Minimo. After the 1968 earthquake that devastated the Belice Valley in western Sicily and left the village of Gibellina uninhabitable, a new town was built about 20 kilometers away. By the early 1980s, much of Gibellina Nuova had been built. Trees had been planted, residents had moved in, and yet there was a widespread feeling that the new town was not working as intended. The interventions of renowned architects and artists remained fragments, a mere agglomeration of buildings and blocks that did not form a community. There was an absence in between them, a lack of life in the newly built town. In response, a series of congresses and workshops were held with artists, planners, and academics from around the world to reassess the project. The leaflet in the archive folder refers to one of these meetings, organized by the Swiss sociologist Lucius Burckhardt together with the French landscape architect Bernard Lassus. Burckhardt later recalled that the conventions were part of Gibellina's endeavor to raise awareness of problems impending, since the open spaces in this English new town were laid out far too large for the scorching days of summer in a small Sicilian town. Although both Ungers' project and the workshop took place in the same town in Sicily, the isolated leaflet raises the question of why it was incorporated into the project documentation. It sits right at the beginning of the folder, almost as a starting point, and yet, perhaps the only overtly minimal aspect of the architectural intervention lies in its neo-rationalist formal repertoire. In many ways, Lucius Burckhardt and Oswald Mathias Ungers stood for fundamentally different approaches to planning during this time. While Burckhardt was critical of planning per se, culminating in the question, who plans the planning? Ungers was drawn to authorial facets of architecture that went beyond the practical. By this time, he was beginning to design a large number of public buildings in Germany and beyond, arguably more concerned with the aesthetic and experimental qualities of space than with mere practical requirements. This is not to say that Ungers was uninterested in Burckhardt's approach. Indeed, he had invited him to speak at the now famous Congress on Architectural Theory at the TU Berlin in 1968, whose lectures were disrupted by student protesters holding up banners reading, "All buildings are beautiful," and "Stop building." Slogans that may have had some resonance with Burckhardt's approach, but for Ungers were another blow at a difficult time academically and professionally, and eventually contributed to his resignation from his teaching post in Berlin. Soon after, he left Germany for the United States and would effectively cease building for more than a decade, in a strange twist of fate, actually following the protesters' demands. The project in Gibellina, begun in the early 1980s, coincided with Ungers' return to building after this long hiatus, in some way forming a hinge between fairly distinct phases of his career. Despite the increasing concentration on abstract, discipline-centered concerns in his later architecture practice, Ungers' early work was very much focused on specific situations, emblematically captured in projects such as the competition entry Grundzug Süd, which focused on specific aspects of the everyday context of a southern Cologne neighborhood. A year later, the famous Berlin A Green Archipelago presented an approach to a shrinking Berlin that focused less on building something new and more on redesigning what already existed. These unrealized projects propagated an approach that was reactive rather than imposing, perhaps best reflected in Kirsten Gier's observation that the best of Ungers' architecture does not involve design. It only organizes what is already there. In a somewhat similar vein, Ungers' project at Gibellina Nuova was intended to bring together the desperate architectural and artistic fragments left behind by the other contributors. Beyond the mere provision of housing and services, the brief seems to have been to create a sense of civic life that was sorely absent. Many of Ungers' projects, perhaps more prominently today the Green Archipelago and Rem Koolhaas' contribution, were developed collaboratively. The Gibellina project was no exception, this time co-authored with Ungers' son Simon, who had just graduated from Cornell. Furthermore, a significant but often unrecognized figure during the conception of the project was the local architect Marcella Aprile. Some sources suggest that she played a crucial role in the execution of the project, which she herself denied. But she certainly provided important local knowledge and was the main point of communication during the initial design phase. In the end, what was sent to Sicily from Cologne was not so much a construction proposal as a conceptual design study, clearly intended as a basis for further development. The submission included plans with explanatory text, a series of reference images, the Forum Romanum, the Athenian Agora, a Città Ideale painting, and a series of line-drawn perspectives. It is telling that these perspectives, as idealized as the reference that accompanies them, clearly depict an imagined ideal city rather than the small rural town for which they were intended. There is a clear sense that the proposal was not just for buildings, but for a series of places, in a sense reverse engineering the civic features of a historic town center for the existing disconnected urban structures. However, this ambitious scheme was never fully realized, probably due to financial constraints, and the project ended up being shelved. Towards the end of the 1980s, the municipal authorities finally managed to start construction on a much reduced version of the proposal, finalized and executed without the involvement of Ungers. Instead of bringing together the fragments of the earlier reconstruction, it was just another series of buildings, no more than just other fragments in themselves. In many ways, then, the completed project is a far cry from the original plan, a mere fraction of the ambitions, even a failure. But then, who says that a building should be judged by the original intentions of its author? In many ways, it may be distance or even isolation that allowed this project to take on a life of its own. built on a remote part of Sicily, beyond the confining grip of an author who actually may, just like the author of this text, never have visited the built result, out of reach of acute financial pressure on the real estate. It is still there, partly constructed, partly renovated, partly dilapidated, but still standing. As a whole, the nucleus of the design by the two Ungers, the locally carried out realization and the adaptations by various others provide a formally strict but structurally flexible framework to be reappropriated. One is reminded of a 1960s lecture on large-scale housing in which Ungers concluded that such projects are merely the framework, the structure, and the planned space for an unpredictable, unplanned, vivid process, for a parasitic architecture. Without this aspect, all planning remains rigid and lifeless. In this sense, the building seems to have avoided such planned rigidity, not so much because of the architectural quality, which remains open to interpretation, but because of the local resonance. Despite its origins on a drawing board thousands of kilometers away, the building has now become an integral part of this new and slightly surreal, but certainly real place, Gibellina Nuova. It is precisely this reality that Tommaso Mola Meregalli's photographs convey. They show that this project has become a place, nothing extraordinary, not precious, but alive. That these houses may not be in the best condition, except for the recently renovated one, perhaps even dilapidated in some corners, but that other parts are well cared for. In this sense, and to return to the L'Intervento Minimo leaflet at the beginning of the folder, one feels compelled to quote Burckhardt's concluding words from an essay on Gibellina and the concept of minimal intervention, written in 1982, around the time the plans for Ungers' Gibellina project were submitted. Whatever is unfinished or already ruinous is the antithesis of those neat solutions which, always orthodox and always ending in disaster, destroy our world. Rather far from the centers of that world, and left more or less to itself for almost half a century, the appeal of the project today may just lie in the mundane yet captivating convergence of planned orthodoxy, constructed incompleteness, and mere everyday inhabitation. The leaflet may not have had a direct influence on the development of the project itself, but it undeniably resonates with the blog today. In that sense, it seems to have every right to be in that nondescript folder in the archive. Dopotutto.